Welcome to No Filter. We have an amazing guest today. This is going to be a topic that I've been wanting to talk about for so long. This is Kemp. He's an active blogger and a theologian. Currently working on a book called The Beached White Male. It talks about kind of the deconstruction of the normative white evangelical kind of movement based in fundamentalism and how he kind of escaped it, dealt with it, confronted it, and we're so glad to have you here today. Of course, we have Dr. Lee from Fuller Seminary. So first question right off the bat, has America ever been a Christian nation?
Well, you know what, Kenneth, I think it looks like a Christian nation, but if you look historically, it really isn't.
Constitutionally,
it never really has been. But you know, one of the things that has been meaningful to me is to come to realize that in the world that I lived in, there was a real emphasis on biblical worldview. But the problem is that I was growing up in my own little white evangelical tribe, and we called our worldview a biblical worldview, but really it was a tribal narrative. It was our own little tribal narrative. And part of that tribal narrative was to say this is a Christian nation, that are obligated, you know, that we're obligated to make sure everybody becomes a Christian in our nation. But if you look at the founders, that's really not what they had in mind at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
I want to add, constitutionally, America has never been the Christian nation, and there is a separation of, church and state, right? But in terms of culture, it has been almost consistently Christian in many ways up until 1960s. That's why I think we now experience, very polarized form of cultural clashes or even cultural war between progressive or seculars on the one side, more traditionalists and, Christians on the other side. So one example is Thanksgiving. It's a very Christian celebration of the harvest, festival.
Right.
And also our president in inauguration put their hands on the Bible. Also other elected, officials, even in the court.
You have to swear on the Bible.
Yeah, swear on the Bible. So I believe we need to understand the sentiments of certain conservative Christians. Somehow in deep down their soul, heart, they believe this country was possible because of God, because of our Christian ancestors. So legal issue, constitution is more about the convenience or pragmatic decision, I would say, of that time. But on the stream of this nation is a Christian. That's my way of reading American history.
So it seems like you're making a distinction between like a culture of Christianity or American Christianity versus what we read in the Bible, what we want to read as a better reading of the Bible.
And another aspect that I think is a legal dimension is also very important, Constitution. So it depends on which one you take your reference point. If you take a Constitution, beginning of Republic, then America is a secular, right? But if it goes back all the way to Mayflower, early settlers, culturally you could say, oh, this is very Christian. So I think that's one of our problems today. When there's a separation between church and state, and that's First Amendment that protects religious freedom. Actually, it respects both sides. Practice of religion, free exercise of your religion on the one side, but also separation between church and state.
For hundreds of years, Christianity was identified with a state church, with the divine right of the kings. In fact, we're just watching
in Europe,
The Crown, right? And the Queen is the head of the church in England to this very day.
Yeah.
But our founders said, no, we're not going to have a state church. We're going to encourage religion. We're going to give benefits, but we're not going to identify which religion it is. We're going to recognize the conscience of the individual person to decide how they're going to worship God. And what's interesting now to me is that in European culture, where there is a state church, where it's funded and beautiful structures, these countries are not very religious. But America is very religious, and I think that one of the reasons we flourish is because we recognize the individual's right to decide, to make their own decision about where and whom they're going to worship.
So Constitution, that First Amendment was, in a way, it was inevitable because there are so many different kinds of Christianity already here in this land.
Right.
Quakers, Mennonites, and Presbyterians, and Anglicans. So you name it. So only way is not choosing one religion over against, but actually embracing it. So that's, I believe, is the beginning of liberal democracy,
right?
Of forming religious freedom. Yeah.
Well, even in the question itself, like, is America a Christian nation? Like, for me, I have to ask, like, who's America and who's Christianity? Because from my understanding, it was shaped mostly by white males in power. And so their context is going to kind of shape what that Christianity look like. Their theology, their viewpoint, whether they believed slavery was right or wrong, like that's going to shape what Christianity is. And I feel like a lot of us, especially as a Korean American, we received Christianity from Westerners, that shapes like a whole like body of Christians, because that's like the main paradigm is that view.
Yeah, if I piggyback on your question and sharing my reflection, I believe politics becomes so radical and also polarizing because this issue of whether America is a Christian, that touches the core of identity, especially for white evangelicals. It's their identity issue. Because identity is the deepest sense of who I am, right? So whole this Trumpism is connected with not just economics, but more deeply with this identity issue. So if I pick up your comment, whether immigrants, even Christian immigrants, let's say even evangelical immigrants who happen not to be white, whether they are welcomed here.
Right.
That's, I think, is whether Christian identity claimed by white conservatives is actually more about the whiteness or more about Christian.
So that's exactly
because
what
many Latina immigrants happen to be Christians.
Yeah.
But look at what is happening at the border. Even refugees. Think about that humanitarian crisis happening. That's why I believe we need to talk about this issue.
Yeah.
So what's driven my journey is I think we all kind of develop a concern over the stereotype about who we are.
Yeah.
So I mean, all you have to do is look on the camera now, and you're looking at an aging white male. I'm a baby boomer.
Okay.
In addition, and of course you don't hear the word boomer without attaching the word aging anymore. So,
me too.
There you go. And people assume, a political caricature of me just by looking at who I am. And it's been about 10 years now because this really started in me some time ago, but what has now become this evangelicalism that is associated with the supporters of Donald Trump. And generally they will be identified not just as evangelicals, but white evangelicals. That's been very disturbing to me.
Yeah,
because
80-some percent.
80-some
for Trump.
80-some percent.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit earlier about the caricature of Jesus and what we perceived of him. And so for the life of me, I cannot understand how it is that the Jesus that drew me in many years ago is the same Jesus now that is a card-carrying, conservative, sword-wielding Republican who's also an evangelical. I can't picture that. And that has been a huge disconnect for me.
I see. So how you address that tension within you? You grew up as a white evangelical, but at the same time, you're now making that, distinction. Huh?
Well, I've been intentionally trying to put myself in places where I'm outside that bubble. And one of the places that happened was where you and I met, Dr. Lee, when we traveled together through the South on the racial reconciliation tour of the South. And we really exposed ourselves to the plight of African Americans in this country since 1619, when they arrived on the first slave ship. It really kind of shattered a lot of the assumptions and a lot of the narrative that I had grown up with.
Okay, so for the viewers that are curious, because I'm curious, right now, evangelicalism, fundamentalist, that's been kind of equivalent to Trump supporter right now.
Right.
Yes,
that's right.
Yes.
But from our conversation before, and obviously this is true, like there are people that are fundamentalists, that are evangelical, and they're conservative, but don't necessarily agree with Trump, or they don't necessarily like support Trump. How do we distinguish that when it seems like, just even from the statistic you show, like 80% of white males that voted for Trump for evangelical,
right?
How do we distinguish that?
Let me make a very quick comment. Majority of African American churchgoers are evangelicals, black evangelicals, but more than 90% of them voted against Trump.
Right.
So if you lump all evangelicals into one category, then you're actually making a mistake. That's why we now looking at how the race issue intersect with politics. Right? So even I believe within the white evangelicals who, like you, right, distance themselves from this politicized form of evangelicalism, or
In the early 70s, I went to school. I attended school with Dr. Jim Wallace, Sojourners.
Oh yeah.
And he has, for his entire career, he's represented an evangelicalism that is really kind of on the other side of the political spectrum from what we now think of as evangelicals, largely because of media. I mean, when we see the statistics and the graphs and everything, it's so lopsided in the direction of Trump for white evangelicals. But evangelicalism is way more diverse.
And also, I want to really make a distinction theologically and historically between evangelicalism and fundamentalism. Actually, evangelicalism is reaction, critical response to fundamentalism on right side, and secular liberalism on the left. But now, it is all, the distinction is gone, partly because of media, or some fundamentalists prefer to be called evangelicals. As fundamentalists lost that attraction.
Yeah, those of us who grew up in this evangelical bubble are really having an identity crisis right now. Because what is understood as evangelicalism is not
originally and traditionally, right?
We are, and so the question then, well, how do we handle that? It's hard for me to identify as an evangelical anymore because people immediately assume.
I like what's going on here because, okay, there's an evangelicalism that's on the far right, where, and I'm painting with broad strokes, so I'm not being completely fair, but from what I understand, the Jesus on the far right, he's going to care about guns, right? Like he's going to protect the guns. He's going to protect
nation.
Yeah, the nation. It's very
abortion.
Important. And abortion, protecting our borders is
LGBT.
very LGBTQ is not on the table. Jesus would be like, no. On the other side, let's even talk about a Jesus that cares about social justice, cares about people that are refugees, about gun control.
Yeah, that's a more progressive side of evangelical.
Right.
Yeah.
So there might be people that are watching that are like, okay, so which Jesus is right according to the Bible?
And so that's the big question, isn't it? Who do you say that I am? I also love Paul, where he said, work out your own salvation in fear and trembling, where we all have that issue. And I'm guessing you shared this with me. There have been times in my life where Jesus was very real to me, and powerful, and overwhelming, and then there have been other times where I've wondered, okay, is this just a construct, from my tribal narrative, that I've created this Superman in my mind and that I've just been following him? But who is he? Who was the Jesus of history? What did he really say? What can we count on? What really happened? And those questions, I think, are in the back of all of our minds who have bothered to think about those things. Not everybody does, of course. But I look at our obsession in white evangelicalism with Matthew 28, go ye therefore into all the nations. And, Christianity has been identified with empire for most of history, for most of history since Jesus was here. And I see that obsession with the Great Commission as being kind of a reflection of our need to have empire, to bring it all together, just to be like us. But then I go to Matthew 25 and I see a different picture of Jesus, where Jesus says to his disciples, and the disciples are saying, how do we do this? And Jesus says, well, where were you when I was naked? And I don't remember. And where were you when I was hungry? And where were you when I was in prison? And the disciples are going, oh, I don't remember any of that, Jesus. But then he says, to the extent that you will get yourself out of your comfort zone, put yourself in the place where you are coming face to face with problems you will never be able to solve, and look into the eyes of real people,
the least of these.
The least of these, and you reach out and you work to do what you can to bring love and joy and grace and peace, I'll find you there. I'll be there.
In other words, the progressive evangelicals tend to prefer Matthew 25 over 28. And the conservative or fundamentalist is always preferring Matthew 28. But Matthew 28 was written and proclaimed when Christianity was not empire, right? But in current context, when America operating as the superpower of the world for many years after World War II, Matthew 28 is always understood in that context. Idea is use your national power, gun, tank, missile, diplomacy, whatever, to propagate gospel. Then Jesus become more of the universal king. Right? He is, but not that in the sense of Matthew 25.
Yes, the Jesus that washes your feet.
Yeah.
I remember when I was privileged to go to Rome, and we went to St. Peter's Basilica, and it was this massive, massive cathedral, and massive space, and beautiful art. And I don't know why, but when I walked in there, I just kind of imagined Jesus, walking in there with me, and going, wow, all this for me? I think somebody missed something. This isn't quite what I had in mind. And then I'm in a slum in Calcutta.
India.
And I find myself with people who basically have nothing, but there's a joy that fills them. And I found out they were Jesus followers. And I walked out of there going, wow, I just found Jesus.
I believe if we do not take Matthew 25 seriously, we lose ability, the seeing ability or epistemological ability to understand what Jesus' teaching is. And I think that's the source of all this trouble. Because when American white Christians go out teach Jesus' teaching, following the Matthew 28 Great Commission, they pretty much teach tall, white, blue-eyed Jesus.
Right.
And also content of gospel is pretty much if you believe in Jesus, then you will be successful, you will be rich. So they preach capitalism. That's how much Jesus' original message in Sermon on the Mount is hijacked and changed into, I would say, almost message of power and mammon.
In other words, I hear both you gentlemen saying when Jesus says the kingdom is on the move, it's not necessarily a kingdom that represents a nation state that is trying to culturally influence, economically influence,
Exactly.
So that people can go to a heaven out there,
Yeah.
but rather it's about justice, it's about poor people having greater opportunity. It's about people in the LGBTQ community or any marginalized community feeling like they have a place at the table. But not only that, they get to set the terms on what the table should look like. That's kind of what I'm hearing. One of the kind of reasons, from what I understand, why there's such a push for like right-wing, hardline, even like alt-right, like extremism, even though they're Christians, is at the bottom line there's fear. And I think that fear is legitimate. That's something that I share even as like a left-leaning, like more progressive Christian, is that there's a fear of globalization. There's a fear of like the way less jobs in America. There's a fear of like what's going on in the world because of global warming and all those things. The fear also, from what I understand, of white evangelicals, or not even just evangelicals, but particularly white men, is that they're losing power. Meaning that there's more equality, there's going to be more people of diverse races going into positions of power. And one of the chants in the Charlottesville, do you remember the Charlottesville riot? Is they were saying, "You will not replace us."
Right.
You remember that?
Right.
They were
Yes.
saying, "You will not replace us."
Carrying the torches.
Carrying the torches, because you're taking down our Confederate statues, our Confederate flag. Do you empathize as a white male with that fear of being like, hey, maybe as a white American, I'm going to be losing privilege? Do you ever
Or your circle of
your
friends.
circle of friends or yourself ever feel?
I see it. I do see it. You know what was a turning point for me was a cover story on Newsweek magazine. This is going back to 2011, but there was a picture of this white guy. He's probably 50 in a Brooks Brothers suit and a crisp white collar, carrying an expensive leather briefcase, but he was laying face down on the sand, and the waves were lapping up over his Oxford shoes, and his tie was kind of out there, and he looked like he was almost unconscious. And this is where I stole the phrase. The big headline was "The Beached White Male," and he said it says, he had a big job, had a big house, had a big family, had a beautiful car, had a big retirement plan, had his health insurance, but now he doesn't have a freaking prayer. That was the line on the front of the magazine. And I read the story, and it really was it was powerful for me, because me and a lot of my friends, feel that way. You'll talk to them about it. I had a conversation with a guy the other day who was saying, "Oh yeah, we need a new board member, but I can't get a white guy, and he has to be non-white," and he resented that. And I think the attitude towards affirmative action in this whole white world is an indicator of, I'm afraid I'm losing my power and my influence. But what hit me, in reading that article and even talking about, this book that I've written, which is kind of like my memoir, and I call it The Beached White Male, is that, if I'm going to earn a place in this society and in this culture, I have to earn it like everybody else. I can't assume that just because I'm white and because I'm, whatever, that I'm going to, have something that other people can't. And that was a powerful kind of turning point for me. But then I began to assess a lot of things about how in my tribal narrative there were words that are really great words, but they become pejoratives. You know, for example, liberal. If you say liberal in a white tribal evangelical culture, you know, it's like, oh, we're liberal.
Right.
Or if you say tolerant, you know, say the word tolerant and see what kind of reaction you get in that world. Or say the word diversity.
That's right.
Yeah, you know, or say the word, you know, say equal pay.
Okay.
You know, any one of those lines, the reaction you get is a reflection of this assumed white privilege that's being denied out there. And for me, if we're going to make any progress at all, we've got to own the fact that we've relied on this false narrative of white privilege, and that we have to understand that we're human beings. And I believe this is so Jesus.
So how did you get to where you are right now? So can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Were you on that other side? Do you feel like you were ever on the side of a privileged white male that felt triggered by those terms at one point in your life?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say that it's like the frog in the kettle. You know, it's you know, I think I was there, but I didn't think about it. I just assumed that that's the way the world is, you know. And in coming to terms with this, and for me, it came from a rough ministry experience where I was a part of a church, and I just could not relate to this tribal narrative that, and it ended up, it ended badly. I mean, there was like, there wasn't a scandal or anything, but I just ended up wondering what the heck happened. And I began to read books. I began to feel like a disenfranchised evangelical in this pursuit. And then I discovered that there's a whole cottage industry right now out there of people who have been raised in evangelical cultures, not just white, there are other places too, like legalistic evangelical, who are, it's almost like, it's like deprogramming from a cult. It's how do I'm no longer a part of that group anymore. How is it now that I relate to the rest of the world, and who am I? And I've got a reading list at the back of my book, and there are, I think, 150 books in there that I just started reading voraciously and finding out that there's a whole different world out there. And in many ways, it was liberating.
Do you have like a specific moment that was an example of like, whoa, Jesus opened my eyes to that bigger world that you're talking about?
Yeah, you know, so a big one for me came when I was listening to Sean Hannity.
I see.
And
Fox News, right?
Yeah, this is going back when Obama ran for the first run. Was that 2008?
Yeah.
It was 2008, so that's when it was. And this crisis comes out with Jeremiah Wright.
Tell us.
Jeremiah Wright is the preacher at Trinity United Methodist Church in the south side of Chicago, who's an animated social worker, but he's also the guy who led Barack Obama to Jesus and did Michelle and Barack's wedding. And when Barack Obama was a community activist in South Chicago, he was a part of this church.
Yeah.
Well, from the pulpit, Jeremiah Wright said, America. Pardon me, can we do that here?
That's fine, yeah.
But you might remember that.
Yeah, I
so
remember.
Sean Hannity thinks, okay, we now have Obama. Because his pastor said America from the pulpit. And and by the way, by this time, I'm listening to these guys talk about, like Sean Hannity talks about how people accuse him of being a racist, and he goes off on a big rant of how I'm not a racist. I dare you to come up with any evidence that I'm a racist. But what he did was he took that soundbite and he played it over and over and over and over again for weeks at a time.
I would say it was taken out of the context.
So I go back, so I go back and I'm thinking, okay, I lived in Chicago for 3 years. I lived right in the city. I got all over the place. And, I came to understand a little bit about the plight of African Americans in the big city of Chicago. And I went back and I said, I've got to listen to the whole sermon.
Okay.
Which is what I did.
Wow. Which is what I believe 80% of people won't do.
Exactly.
They'll take the soundbite, but please continue.
Exactly. Yeah. And as I listened to this sermon that was so full of passion and conviction, what he's basically saying is that our people have been exploited and terrorized and murdered and lynched. And God, please do something. Bring your judgment down to give us some justice in the light of what's happened to us. Yeah. And the phrase that came out of his mouth was, God damn America. It was a prayer.
Yeah.
Like a prayer for justice.
Some passages in the book of Psalm, you know. Huh?
And I thought, it got me. And I thought, you son of a gun, Sean Hannity, for exploiting this moment to take out the first African American candidate for the presidency who has actually got a shot, and you're using this as a way to inflame people in ways that are just it was an injustice. That's actually when I turned off conservative radio. I couldn't listen to it anymore because it so violated, what I believe to be true and right. So in my white tribal, narrative, feminism was attacked.
Another
right.
Bad word, right?
Yes. Yeah. And then when people started coming out as homosexual, that was like, I mean, how many denominations have split over that? Because, but I see these movements as backlash. I mean, does anybody sit down and say, why are these women so angry?
Oh, I see.
Why is it that we forced them into their little ghettos where they're writing their own books and they're angry? Well, it's because of what they've experienced, and you look at LGBT, you say this, and the in-your-face stuff. This is really the result of the treatment that people who are not fitting into our binary, our gender binary, and the mistreatment is going to result in this kind of backlash. Why can't we sit down and say, why? Tell me what happened to you. Tell me who you are. But instead, we build walls. We build the wall.
Actually, Native Americans do not celebrate Thanksgiving.
Of course not.
For them, it's called the Day of Mourning. Their native land and the family and tribes are destroyed. So we need to look at the history.
And we need to own it. We need to own it.
I'm trying to think about if I were to reach out across the table to, let's say, somebody that's totally on the far right? And to them, they grew up with walking by the Confederate statue and the flag and saying, oh, there's history here. This is my history. And then to think about Thanksgiving as something that is a source of pride. And here I have the truth. And I'm trying to give the truth, right? But there's a tendency sometimes, I think, if the truth is presented with anger or some sort of
sarcasm
or something like that, because I'll be honest, and I'll be vulnerable. There have been times on Facebook I'll say some really nasty things, I'll fucking cuss out people, and then I'll write all these things, and I'll be like, oh, I'm self-righteous, I'm right. But I had to take a step back and be like, this is not penetrating, right? So practically, how do we engage a conversation with a young man or young women on that side?
I got exposed to, in my little journey, and that started as a real funk. got exposed to the language of deconstruct, reconstruct, which was very helpful to me. But to respond to your question, Kenneth, it's hard. This is a really hard conversation. We've talked to John Williams about this at the Center for Racial Reconciliation over here at Monrovia, because there's so much resistance that's built into the cake, that's baked in the cake,
And also,
to dealing with the issues.
also it's been going on over the several centuries.
It's yes.
So its roots go so deep down there. We don't see the end yet, in a way.
I don't know my history. So throughout the several centuries, the people leading that conversation, has that been white males?
Yes, absolutely.
So they're the
Even
ones...
Immanuel Kant, he categorized every human race.
Yeah.
No, meaning like the people that are leading the talk on deconstructing, reconstructing, is that white males? I'm curious.
No, actually, it came from. That would be great if
You know
that
what I mean?
happened.
Do you see where I'm
No,
getting at?
this is
Yeah,
what
right.
James Cone talked about. You know, the prominent theologians of America and Europe never talked about race issue as a theological issue. So as a theologian, he's the first one.
Yeah, James
So he
Cone
made-
is on my list.
Yeah.
love
So
that.
think about
Love
it.
that.
So in a way, the white privilege, it touched every aspect, including theology, church, preaching, ministry, every aspect. That's how much
Right.
This world is constructed by white. So occasionally I talk to my students. Me, as a person of Korean heritage, who grew up in Korea, right? And Korea has a longer history than US. And, you know, probably all of Western European countries. It goes all the way back, several millennia, right?
Right.
But why my hairstyle is a completely Western?
And your clothes?
My clothes, but I am really comfortable with this hairstyle and with this. Imagine, that's a power. That's a power, civilizational power of whiteness. So partly, I understand when people, going back to Ken, your comment on your circle of friends, they don't like it, all this language and feminism, diversity, you know, affirmative action. On the one hand, there is a fear not to lose their privileged power, right? But based on my observation, even some good white people has a deep, and I would say genuine concern and anxiety when non-whites get the power and also leadership controlling power. This non-whites gonna mess up entire nation. Idea is non-whites are not intelligent enough, morally righteous enough.
Right.
You understand?
Right.
That's one of the fear people had against Obama.
Right.
So Obama's presidency, I have a lot of criticism on Obama's presidency, especially economic policy, and also drone attack.
and
also
immigration.
Right.
And immigration,
That too.
you know, and also
Yeah.
hold that secret, you know, eavesdropping,
Right.
secret eavesdropping on our handphone. But he proved, at least I give him credit, he proved the African American person can be a competent and decent president.
That could lead our nation. Right.
Yeah. So you need to understand how deep this surface level is a privilege and power, but deep down, they believe that somehow whites are elected by God, or through evolution, they reached a certain level, evolutionary advance or development.
Right. Right.
No other races can match. That's a deep down of their own suspicion about other races.
Okay, so let's say even in Matthew, Jesus, when he sends his disciples out, he specifically tells Jewish men, don't go to non-Jewish communities. Go to your own people. You understand
Yeah.
your people.
Yeah.
In some ways, do you interpret that also for maybe white males that are deconstructed and reconstructed, do you feel that they're called to go back to your own people?
Well, that's a really good point, Kenneth. And as I've kind of shared my journey, in the broader world, the reaction is kind of interesting to me, because they'll say, you're the first white guy I've ever heard talk like this. Wow. And would you go to your people and tell them what you told me?
They will crucify you.
And in my own way, I'm trying to do that, but it's hard. And that's what I come back to, is how difficult it is. We have connections with some of our Christian colleges and universities and so many of them now have an employee or a team that's dedicated to diversity in our Christian schools. Yeah. And we know some of these folks. And you know what? It's been really hard. Yes. For these guys, because this sense of entitlement is so deeply rooted in the DNA of the institutions that while they're happy to put people of color on their brochures, and give the website the look of diversity, when you talk to people who are non-white, who are living in these institutions, they struggle. Yeah. And so you asked the question, Kenneth, what do we do? And what came to my mind is the best thing to do is to do what Jesus said, and that is to get people out of their comfort zone and in the neighborhood and in the group conversation, or on the civil rights tour, or in South Africa where we've been, and put folks in a place where their categories just cannot be maintained. And that's where I've seen breakthrough. That's kind of what happened to me too.
For white people in our time, but this applies for all the Christians, lived with the power and privilege in the past, or will live in the future. For white Christians in our time, Matthew 25 is their Great Commission. Because Matthew 25 is exactly, you need to give up your power, privilege, and comfort and go prison, for example, to a poor neighborhood, immigrant, and identify yourself. Find me there. So that's a message I believe, for people with the power and privilege. Okay. And Matthew 28 is for people without power and privilege. Because they can go out and show the reason of hope and reasons for the love and encouragement, despite their own destitution and poverty and persecution. They can still bring the joy and bring the hope of God's reign to people. Right. In situations.
Thank you, Ken, so much. Thank you, Dr. Lee, so much for coming in. Your insights were just profound, and I love that we had this conversation. And thank you so much for being so vulnerable. Yeah. So at this time, especially if you disagree, we would love to hear what you have to say. Click that thumbs down button, write something on the comments. Obviously, for those of you that are like, man, this is prompting so many more questions. I agree. I love this. Click thumbs up, write it out. We'd love to have a conversation with you. Subscribe. There's way more material like this coming out soon. Ken, such a pleasure. Ken's book,
The Beached White Male.
The Beached White Male is due out.
Sometime soon.
We're going to look out for that. Keep your eyes out. Thank you so much, both gentlemen, and thank you for viewing. Have a blessed day. Yeah.